For 12 years, the Gestapo was the most feared instrument of the Third Reich in Germany. Thousands were ripped from their homes in the middle of the night, interrogated until broken, and sent to camps from which they never returned. Millions learned to live with the certainty that any word could be the last they spoke in freedom. Its internal structure, its ability to infiltrate every corner of society, and its precision in destroying individual lives with the coldness of a bureaucratic procedure were unprecedented in modern history. From an office in Berlin to a network operating simultaneously in 14 countries, processing deportations and feeding the courts of Roland Freisler, who issued 5,179 death sentences and ordered executions to be filmed with piano wires so that Hitler could watch them that very night. The orders came from the High Command, but it was ordinary men who executed them, replacing conscience with blind obedience. This documentary reveals how the Gestapo truly functioned, how an organization born in Berlin in 1933 became a machine capable of persecuting opponents, coordinating courts, and extending its control over much of Europe. What turned millions of ordinary citizens into the most terrifying weapon of the regime? Why did Heinrich Müller disappear in 1945 without a trace? How did a force of only 15,000 agents manage to control 80 million people for 12 years? What happened in 1933 for the Gestapo to be born? On January 30th, 1933, Adolf Hitler came to power as Chancellor of the Reich after weeks of political intrigue in Berlin. The Weimar Republic still formally existed, but within the new cabinet, a different system began to take shape, where police control and the elimination of opponents became an immediate priority. During those first days, the Nazi government sought to secure dominance over Prussia, the largest German state and the administrative center of the country. Hermann Göring, a close ally of Hitler, was given authority over the Prussian Ministry of the Interior and began quickly reorganizing the police with men loyal to the new regime. The police departments of Berlin and other cities started to change leadership, with officers suspected of sympathizing with democratic parties being removed. In their place, officials appeared who were willing to collaborate with the new political direction. At the same time, militants from the National Socialist Party began patrolling the streets alongside police operations. The immediate goal was to neutralize political adversaries who still had active structures, especially communists and social democrats. Existing police files were quickly reviewed to identify leaders, organizers, and militants. This database allowed for the preparation of the first raids against party headquarters and union offices. On the night of February 27, 1933, a fire destroyed much of the Reichstag building in Berlin. The fire turned the political crisis into an opportunity to impose extraordinary measures. Nazi leaders claimed the fire was part of a communist revolutionary conspiracy aimed at overthrowing the government. Hours later, President Paul von Hindenburg signed an emergency decree drafted by Hitler's cabinet. The document suspended fundamental freedoms guaranteed by the Weimar Constitution, including freedom of the press, the inviolability of the home, and protection against arbitrary detentions. The police were given unrestricted powers to act. With that decree in effect, mass arrests began in Berlin, Hamburg, Leipzig, and other industrial cities. Police teams raided the homes of previously identified communist militants from security files. Many of those arrested were taken to police stations where interrogators sought information about underground networks and illegal propaganda. Among the officials tasked with organizing this new repressive machinery was Rudolf Diels, a young jurist working in the Prussian political police. Göring considered him useful because he was familiar with existing files on radical organizations. Diels was given the task of coordinating investigations and overseeing interrogations of opponents. As arrests multiplied, the Prussian Ministry of the Interior began designing a specific institution dedicated exclusively to combating political enemies. The idea was to create a permanent office that would gather information, direct operations, and centralize files. This organization would soon become known as the Gestapo, short for Geheime Staatspolizei. The new secret police of the state was born within the Prussian structure under the direct authority of Göring. Its initial mission was to monitor, investigate, and neutralize movements considered dangerous to the regime. Diels assumed practical leadership of the organization and began organizing offices dedicated to political surveillance. The first months were marked by intense activity. Agents and officials reviewed confiscated correspondence, examined lists of members of banned parties, and prepared reports on neighborhoods considered hostile to the government. Each file contained names, addresses, and backgrounds that allowed for the preparation of new preventive arrests. Preventive detention, known as Schutzhaft, quickly became a central tool that allowed the police to imprison individuals considered dangerous without the need for immediate trial. The official argument stated that the measure protected the state from conspiracies, though in practice it served to eliminate opposition. Improvised interrogation centers appeared in police buildings, administrative offices, and government-seized premises. There, detainees were interrogated for hours by officials seeking to reconstruct underground political networks. The interrogations aimed to obtain names of collaborators, meeting places, and methods of distributing propaganda. Meanwhile, the campaign against left-wing organizations continued to expand. Communist newspapers were shut down, printing presses were registered, and political meetings were dissolved by police patrols. In working-class neighborhoods, the presence of agents and regime sympathizers became increasingly visible, creating an atmosphere of constant surveillance. In March 1933, the new parliament approved the Enabling Act, which granted Hitler the authority to enact laws without legislative approval. Although this process unfolded in the political realm, its consequences directly affected police activity. The Gestapo found a favorable legal framework to expand its operations. Diels and his collaborators began organizing broader files on cultural associations, trade unions, and student circles where criticism of the regime might emerge. Each report was added to a growing system of personal files that allowed the tracking of movements, contacts, and backgrounds of thousands of individuals considered suspicious. Raids also targeted social democratic leaders who tried to maintain legal activities despite government pressure. Party offices were raided, and documents were confiscated to examine possible links to banned organizations. Many local leaders were taken to interrogations in the political police's facilities. Within the state apparatus, the new organization began to gain a reputation as an effective tool for consolidating the regime's power. Officials regularly reported to the Ministry of the Interior on the results of operations, the number of detainees, and the materials seized. These reports reinforced the idea that the political threat was being controlled. At the same time, the atmosphere of fear created by arrests and house searches prompted changes in the daily life of German cities. People who had previously participated in political meetings stopped doing so, while neighbors watched cautiously the presence of police vehicles on the streets. During the spring of 1933, the Gestapo continued to expand its reach. New offices were established in Prussian districts to ensure that central orders were enforced across the territory. Each delegation received instructions on surveillance of banned parties and the tracking of activists. The constant flow of information allowed the political police to create detailed maps of opposition activity. Daily reports described detected meetings, found propaganda materials, and movements of underground leaders. This documentation helped plan coordinated operations between different cities. In Berlin, Rudolf Diels personally supervised many of the most important interrogations. His office reviewed statements from detainees and decided whether they should be released, kept in custody, or transferred to longer detention facilities. Each decision was carefully recorded in official files. On April 20th, 1933, Adolf Hitler's birthday, the police apparatus had already undergone a profound transformation compared to the old political police of the Republic. The Gestapo existed as a specific instrument dedicated to monitoring political enemies and ensuring the stability of the new government. In just a few weeks, the regime had gone from controlling ministries to having a system of persecution capable of registering homes, arresting opponents, and collecting information on broad sectors of German society. This process marked the beginning of an institution that would play a central role in the following years. The first offices, initial files, and operations organized between January and April 1933 laid the foundation upon which the secret state police would later expand, while Berlin became the center from which investigations, arrests, and political surveillance were coordinated across all Prussian territory. April 21, 1933 marked a quiet shift within the new regime's security apparatus. While the Gestapo created in Prussia, continued to expand its files and operations. In other regions of Germany, police forces with similar goals began to emerge. The new political reality required not only controlling the capital, but the entire territory of the Reich. Regional governors, police chiefs, and party leaders sought tools capable of monitoring opponents and ensuring obedience. In this context, another actor within the Nazi power structure began to gain prominence: Heinrich Himmler. Himmler already held a prominent position within the party organization. He led the SS, a formation that had originally emerged as a protective unit for National Socialist leaders. During the first months of the new government, his goal was to transform this structure into a disciplined instrument capable of rivaling other organizations within the movement. The SA, led by Ernst Röhm, had hundreds of thousands of members and patrolled streets, meetings, and government buildings. However, their size and irregular behavior raised concerns within the regime's leadership. Many leaders considered that the SA operated with too much independence. As this latent conflict grew within the party, Himmler quietly advanced in another direction. In Bavaria, he had already managed to reorganize the regional political police under his influence. Instead of relying solely on traditional officials, the new structure incorporated SS members who answered directly to his command. From this model, he began consolidating a police network with objectives similar to those of the Prussian Gestapo. During this process, another key figure emerged: Reinhard Heydrich. A former naval officer, he had joined the SS and soon became Himmler's main collaborator in intelligence matters. His organizational talent allowed him to create a system of files and surveillance that gathered reports from different regions of Germany. Heydrich established an office dedicated exclusively to collecting data on political opponents, organizations considered hostile, and movements critical of the government. Each report was analyzed, classified, and stored for future operations. During the summer of 1933, Himmler's influence began to extend beyond Bavaria. In several German states, political police units were created inspired by the Prussian and Bavarian models. Some formally depended on regional governments, but in practice they began coordinating their activities with the SS. The reports compiled by Heydrich became an essential tool for identifying opposition leaders, underground organizers, and groups considered dangerous. The police system was gradually transforming into a surveillance network connected across various cities. Meanwhile, the relationship between the SA and other sectors of the regime deteriorated. Röhm advocated for turning his organization into the core of a new armed force that would replace the traditional army. This proposal caused concern among military commanders and also among Nazi leaders who saw the SA as a power difficult to control. The patrols of this organization continued to dominate streets and public buildings, but their irregular discipline and political demands were beginning to create tensions within the government. In contrast, the SS cultivated a different image. Himmler insisted on presenting his organization as an orderly, obedient force dedicated to state security tasks. This distinction became increasingly important in internal discussions within the regime. Some leaders began to see the SS as a more reliable alternative to control the police apparatus. The cooperation between Himmler and Heydrich helped strengthen this perception. Their offices produced detailed reports that demonstrated their ability to identify political threats and organize surveillance operations. In early 1934, the conflict between different factions of the regime reached a critical point. Röhm's stance alarmed conservative leaders who had supported Hitler's rise to power, expecting stability. Within the Chancellor's inner circle, concerns about the balance of power within the National Socialist movement were growing. In this context, Himmler and Heydrich expanded their intelligence activities and began to acquire increasing influence within the security system. During the spring of 1934, internal tensions reached their peak. The Nazi leadership had to decide how to resolve the conflict between different organizations competing for power and influence. The solution came at the end of June. Between June 30th and the first days of July, a coordinated operation took place to eliminate leaders considered dangerous to the regime. This episode became known in history as the Night of the Long Knives. During these days, units loyal to the government arrested numerous leaders of the SA and other political opponents. Röhm was arrested and later executed. The operations extended to several German cities and were directed from the power center in Berlin. The objective was to eliminate any figure who could challenge the authority of the Nazi leadership. The consequences of this operation completely transformed the internal balance of the regime. The SA lost much of its political influence, and its capacity to pressure the government disappeared. In contrast, the SS emerged as a strengthened and reliable organization for security tasks. The secret police of the Reich had just been born, but it would soon change hands, and with it, the fate of the regime would change. Who was in charge of the Nazi secret police, and how did the SS take control of the German police system? In August 1936, a merchant from Würzburg entered the local Gestapo office and filed a written complaint against his neighbor. The document stated that the accused had made critical comments about food prices during a conversation on the street, comparing the current economic conditions unfavorably with those before the new government. The accused's name was recorded in a file. An officer checked his background in the existing archives, found no prior political activity, and classified the case as passive surveillance. 3 weeks later, a second complaint arrived about the same person, this time from a co-worker who had overheard similar comments during a break at the factory. With 2 converging reports, the file was upgraded to active status. The suspect was called in for interrogation. He never knew who had denounced him. This mechanism, documented by historian Robert Gellatly from the Gestapo files of Würzburg, preserved after the war, reveals the central contradiction that sustained the system's operation. The Gestapo office in Würzburg, a city of approximately 100,000 inhabitants, had 22 active agents in the central years of the regime. The ratio was 1 officer for every 4,500 citizens. In rural areas, the situation was more extreme. Klaus, Michael Malman, and Gerhard Pohl, studying files from other districts, found areas where the ratio exceeded 1 agent for every 10,000 inhabitants. These numbers made any form of systematic direct surveillance impossible. The Gestapo could not follow conversations, patrol neighborhoods, or infiltrate the dozens of factories, associations, and meeting places where daily life unfolded. Its real power depended on a source that no budget could replace: the information voluntarily provided by the population itself. The formal transfer of the Prussian Gestapo from Hermann Göring to Heinrich Himmler in April 1934 was not an administrative decision but the result of a series of accomplished facts. Göring had created the agency in 1933 under his direct authority in the Prussian Ministry of the Interior, but Himmler had operated in parallel from Bavaria with a different methodology. Instead of building a centralized apparatus from above, he had extended his influence state by state, establishing political police units in each one, with their chiefs reporting directly to him rather than to regional governments. By early 1934, Himmler controlled the political police of all German states except Prussia. Göring calculated that the cost of maintaining an internal confrontation at this point outweighed the value of keeping the agency and signed the transfer. Heinrich was confirmed as the operational head. The man who would lead the daily work in the following years was Heinrich Müller. Müller had built his career in the Bavarian political police during the Weimar Republic by pursuing communists and socialists with an efficiency that his superiors consistently valued in their annual reports. He was not a member of the National Socialist German Workers' Party in 1933, an anomaly that raised concerns in party circles. But Heinrich considered that this background was exactly what was needed to lead an institution that had to function more as an administrative cog than as an ideological body. Müller did not question orders. He built procedures to execute them precisely. He rose through the ranks to become the executive head of the Gestapo, a position he would hold uninterrupted until the final days of the regime. Allied files catalogued him under the nickname his own subordinates used, Gestapo Müller. The typical regional delegation Müller supervised from Berlin operated with a structure divided into specialized sections. One section managed general political affairs, analyzing organizations and movements. Another managed the personal files, where each file accumulated identity data, background information, surveillance reports, and previous administrative resolutions. A third coordinated relations with other security agencies in the district. When a complaint arrived, whether in the form of a letter, a personal visit, or a phone report, the receiving officer opened an entry form, recorded the source with a code that protected the informant's identity, described the content, and assigned a priority category. If the accused already had a prior file, the new data was added to it. If not, a new file was created. The decision to open an active investigation depended on the accumulation of entries and the evaluation of the officer responsible for that section. Within this flow, there were three clearly distinct categories of collaborators. Paid informants, identified in the files with payment codes, received periodic amounts for reports on specific people or groups that the Gestapo had requested to follow. They were the least numerous and the most controlled. Voluntary collaborators acted out of political conviction, believing that their contribution protected the regime from real enemies. The Würzburg files show that this group often included local party members, municipal officials, and teachers. The third group was the largest and most revealing about the system's social dynamics. Citizens with no defined political affiliation who went to the offices or sent letters motivated by entirely private conflicts. One woman denounced her husband after a domestic argument. A tenant reported his landlord after a dispute over the rent. Two employees from the same company denounced each other in the context of a dispute over a promotion. The police apparatus had not created these conflicts. It had simply been available as an instrument to resolve them, and that availability was sufficient to turn private frictions into state files. Gellately's analysis determined that in Würzburg more than 57% of the investigations opened by the Gestapo originated from citizen denunciations. Malman and Paul found similar proportions in other districts they studied. These figures contradicted the model the institution's public image projected. The Gestapo was not an active surveillance network tracking the population. It was a reception and processing system that turned information produced by society itself into administrative files with legal consequences. Parallel to this network of denunciations, another information-gathering mechanism operated with a different logic. The internal SD, Office 3 of the future Reich Central Security Office under Otto Ohlendorf, produced the so-called Meldungen aus dem Reich, periodic reports on the mood of the German population compiled by observers distributed throughout the country. These documents did not seek to identify specific individuals, but rather to measure trends, how much discontent existed regarding food rations, what opinions were circulating about a particular military operation, how the population reacted to a certain speech. The reports arrived in Berlin with a regularity that allowed the regime's leadership to gauge the political climate in different regions. When the Meldungen indicated a concentration of discontent in a specific area, local Gestapo delegations received instructions to intensify attention in that district. The macro information from the SD guided the micro attention of Müller. The combined result of these mechanisms on daily life was a phenomenon that the files do not directly record, but that later research has documented through testimonies and private diaries: widespread self-censorship. In Würzburg and other cities studied, the same files that show the volume of complaints filed also reveal their nature: comments made in semi-private spaces, conversations in taverns or rationing lines or workplaces, expressions that under different circumstances would have passed without consequences. Those who chose not to make such comments left no trace in the files. But post-war testimonies suggest that they represented a much larger fraction of the population than those who were denounced. The Gestapo had not needed to directly monitor this self-censorship. It had been produced as a byproduct of a system whose reputation for omnipresence far outweighed its actual operational capacity. However, the file alone did not produce permanent punishment. For that, another structure was needed, one with robes, benches, and verdicts that the state called justice. And that step began in the Reich courts. The hammer of the Third Reich, Hitler's courts. Roland Freisler, president of the People's Court, transformed the justice system of the Third Reich into a stage where the regime's enemies were publicly humiliated before being sentenced. He returned to Germany in 1920, with 3 years of Russian captivity behind him, a functional knowledge of the language and a conviction that the years in prisoner camps had solidified. Law was an instrument of state power, not a limitation upon it. He had observed in Soviet Russia how a legal system could be built from the ground up to serve a revolution rather than moderate it. This perspective, which his German contemporaries with liberal education would have rejected as an aberration, became the intellectual foundation of his subsequent career. He joined the National Socialist German Workers' Party in 1925, built a career in the Prussian judicial administration, and reached the position of State Secretary in the Reich Ministry of Justice under Franz Gürtner, where he directly participated in drafting the foundation of the new National Socialist criminal system. When, in August 1942, Hitler appointed him president of the Volksgerichtshof, Freisler had spent nearly a decade constructing the doctrine that he would now apply from the most politically visible court of the Reich. The Volksgerichtshof had been created in 1934 as a response to a specific problem that the judicial process of the Reichstag fire trial had uncomfortably exposed. The main defendant, Marinus van der Lubbe, was convicted, but the other 4 defendants, whom the regime considered equally guilty, were acquitted by an ordinary court that applied the legal standards of proof required by law. This acquittal was unacceptable to the Nazi leadership. The new court was designed to make such a result impossible. Its judges combined legal training with verified political credentials. The proceedings excluded effective appeals. The defense had access to the file, but their chances of altering the outcome depended on whether the charges were poorly constructed, which rarely happened when the file came from the Gestapo. Between 1934 and 1944, the court issued 5,179 death sentences. In 1944 alone, this number rose to 2,097, a concentration that reflects the acceleration of repression after the July assassination attempt and the elimination of any distance between judicial procedure and immediate political execution. The Sondergerichte courts handled the majority of ordinary political cases that the Volksgerichtshof did not absorb due to scale reasons. By 1942, 74 special courts were operating across cities throughout the Reich. Their central legislative tool was the Heimtückegesetz, the law against malicious comments, enacted in 1934, which criminalized any statement interpretable as harmful to the regime, the party, its representatives, or the morale needed for the defense of the country. The law did not require the comment to be made in public. It did not require demonstrable political intent. It was enough for someone to have heard it, considered it sufficiently problematic to report it, and for the Gestapo to build a case file based on that report. The files generated by the citizen denunciation mechanism documented in Würzburg directly became the charges presented by Sondergerichte prosecutors before the judges. The procedural times in these courts reflected their function. In many cases, the interval between the arrest of the accused and the verdict was less than 6 weeks. The accused appeared before a panel of 3 judges, heard the charges based on the police file, and had a defender whose ability to intervene effectively depended on the technical quality of the file, not the seriousness of the charge. The records kept from several Sondergerichte show that most defenders limited themselves to requesting clemency once the charges had been established, without challenging the investigation procedures or the admissibility of evidence, partly because the procedural rules of these courts did not provide mechanisms to effectively do so. There were cases where defenders attempted to argue deficiencies in the police file or point out contradictions in the testimonies. Available records show that these attempts rarely changed the outcomes. The case of Georg Elser illustrates the limits of the judicial system as a mechanism of repression when the outcome of a public trial could prove inconvenient. Elser was a carpenter from Baden-Württemberg who, in November 1939, independently placed an explosive device, with no connection to any organization, in the column of the Bürgerbräukeller brewery in Munich, where Hitler gave his annual speech commemorating the 1923 coup. The bomb detonated at 9 p.m. Hitler had left the premises 13 minutes earlier, altering his usual schedule. The explosion killed 8 people and injured 62. Elser was arrested that same night attempting to cross the Swiss border near Constance, carrying a piece of detonator and technical drawings directly linking him to the device. The interrogations quickly confirmed his sole responsibility. The regime faced a contradiction that no ordinary process could resolve. Elser was a man with no known political affiliation, no verifiable links to foreign intelligence services, and no connections to underground organizations. Presenting him before the Volksgerichtshof would have required constructing charges based on facts that the regime itself could not fit into the narrative of international conspiracy that it politically needed. Elsa was transferred to Sachsenhausen as a special prisoner, kept in conditions of managed isolation, and transferred to Dachau in 1941, where he remained without a formal trial for over 5 years. Days before the Allied troops arrived at the camp, he was given a lethal injection by order of the SS. The official statement described his death as the result of an Allied bombing. That outcome revealed something that the ordinary functioning of the Sondergerichte and the Volksgerichtshof tended to obscure. The Schutzhaft, or administrative preventive detention, allowed the regime to bypass the judicial apparatus when the outcome of a trial could be operationally inconvenient. Müller did not always need Freisler. He could keep someone indefinitely outside of any procedural framework, without formal charges, without a defense, and without a documented verdict, using an administrative tool that the Gestapo applied without judicial intervention. The choice between a trial and indefinite preventive detention depended on a specific political calculation in each case. If the publicity of the trial reinforced the regime's authority, the trial was chosen. If it could compromise it, the Schutzhaft file was selected. This flexibility made the judicial and police systems not alternative mechanisms but complementary tools whose combination the regime could adjust as needed. To quantify the total volume of the system between 1933 and 1939, available judicial records from various German regions show that the Sondergerichte processed tens of thousands of political cases during that period. In Prussia alone, the preserved records indicate more than 20,000 cases for crimes covered by the Heimtücke-Gesetz between 1933 and 1939. The sentences included prison terms ranging from several months to several years, fines, and in cases with more serious charges, transfer to concentration camps after serving the formal sentence. Each file that reached the prosecutor came from the Gestapo. Each sentence the judge issued retroactively reinforced the legitimacy of the police investigation that had generated it. The two systems fed into each other, and this reciprocity was the true mechanism for stabilizing the repressive apparatus. For years, the Gestapo and the Reich courts had worked together to control German society. But in September 1939, that system crossed a boundary. The war would turn it into something completely different, a police apparatus capable of operating across an entire continent. The police empire of the Third Reich expands across Europe. On September 27, 1939, while the last Polish units were resisting in Warsaw and on the Hel Peninsula, Heydrich signed in Berlin the foundational document for the Reich Security Main Office, Reichssicherheitshauptamt. The new structure was not the result of a previously planned administrative reform, but rather an operational necessity that had become urgent in the first weeks of the war. The issue was not one of resources, but of institutional architecture. The Gestapo, the SD, and the Reich Criminal Police had until that point functioned as agencies with partially overlapping jurisdictions and chains of command that converged at different points. In Poland, this dispersion had created specific frictions. Units from the Gestapo and SD sometimes operated on the same targets without coordination, duplicating efforts and wasting time in a scenario where the speed of political control establishment was critical. The Reich Security Main Office eliminated these frictions by concentrating everything under a single direction. To understand how this system operated in the following years, it is necessary to see it in action. The Sixth Office, the Foreign Intelligence Division under Walter Schellenberg, had accumulated for years files on the Polish political, military, and intellectual elite, built from diplomatic sources, foreign agents, and press analysis. When the Einsatzgruppen crossed the border on September 1st, they carried lists compiled from this material. They did not need to identify targets on the ground. The targets were already named, classified by priority, and associated with known addresses. This chain between the Sixth Office in Berlin and the commanders of the mobile units on the ground was precisely what the previous system could not produce with such fluidity. The Third Office, the internal SD under Otto Ohlendorf, produced the Meldungen aus dem Reich. The information crossed into the Fourth Office of Müller, which instructed the local Gestapo delegation to intensify attention in that district. The two offices were not coordinated through meetings or formal requests, but through a documentary flow that Heinrich integrated before presenting it to Himmler. The chain was short, response times were fast, and operational decisions could be executed before the situations that generated them stabilized on their own. The first large-scale application of this architecture was Poland. The Einsatzgruppen, formed weeks before the invasion with personnel from the Gestapo, SD and Order Police, operated from the first day with the lists from the 6th Office. In the first weeks of occupation, thousands of political leaders, Polish army officers, academics, state officials and priests were arrested with the precision of files created in Berlin years in advance. The AB operation, carried out during the spring of 1940 under the authority of Governor-General Hans Frank, and coordinated directly with the RSHA, expanded this process with a stated goal in the internal documents: to eliminate the layers of Polish society with sufficient organizational capacity to sustain structured resistance. Available records indicate that approximately 26,000 people were executed as part of this operation between April and June 1940. Another 30,000 were sent to concentration camps. The logic was not punitive in the ordinary sense of the term. It was preventive in the most radical sense, to destroy the leadership capacity of a society before that capacity could organize itself. In December 1941, Hitler signed a decree drafted by Marshal Wilhelm Keitel that added a specific dimension to the repression system in occupied territories, which ordinary deportations did not cover. The document, internally known as Nacht und Nebel, night and fog, established that certain detainees considered dangerous to German security but whose immediate execution could create martyrs or provoke adverse reactions from the local population should be transported to the interior of Germany without notification to their families or any external authority. Internal correspondence between Keitel and the Reich Security Main Office explained the reasoning with precision. The uncertainty about the whereabouts and fate of a detainee produced a deterrent effect superior to what known sentences could generate, as it eliminated the possibility that the detainee's environment could build a narrative of martyrdom or resistance around their case. In Norway, groups of resistance fighters captured in 1942 were classified under this procedure and transferred to the Natzweiler Struthof camp in Alsace, then part of the Reich. Their families in Oslo and Bergen received official communications confirming the arrest but provided no information about the detainee's fate or condition. Records from the camp, partially recovered after the war, show that several of these prisoners died in Natzweiler without their families knowing for years whether they were alive or dead, in which country they were held, or under what conditions they had been detained. In France, the decree was applied to members of resistance networks whose public visibility made their immediate execution politically costly in French territory. Those transferred under this procedure disappeared administratively as soon as they crossed the German border. Müller's office coordinated these movements through a documentary chain that included authorization forms, transport lists, and receipt confirmations between the regional delegation of origin and the receiving camp. Each prisoner generated a complete bureaucratic trace, although their family would never know they existed. The logistics supporting these transfers and the entire deportation system from occupied territories depended on coordination between the RSHA, the SS, and the Reichsbahn, which had been progressively perfected since the early years of the regime. Trains in the German railway network transported detainees in reserved cars, managed through a request and confirmation system between the police administration and the operational management of the railways. The cost of transportation was billed to the Gestapo at the third-class fare rate per detainee, one way without return. This accounting detail, recovered from the Reichsbahn archives after the war by historian Raoul Hilberg, illustrates the degree of administrative normalization the system had reached. The logistical extermination of people was processed with the same forms, the same billing procedures, and the same confirmation timelines as any other passenger transport service in the ordinary network. In May 1942, Heinrich was appointed acting protector of Bohemia and Moravia, adding to his duties at the RSHA the direct administration of an occupied territory with a strategically critical industrial population for German war production. His policy combined increases in food rations for workers in munitions factories with severe and immediate repression of any political activity. a strategy he described in Internal Communications as the combination of the whip and sugar applied with surgical precision depending on the segment of the population. On May 27th, a command formed by Józef Gabčík and Jan Kubis, Czech paratroopers trained by the British SOE and dropped into the Protectorate in December 1941, attacked his open vehicle on a curve of the road between Holsavis and Prague Castle. The bomb Kubis threw did not detonate directly on the vehicle, but the explosion sent fragments of the car body into Heydrich's abdomen. He died from his injuries on June 4th. The reprisal that followed was a calculated political decision. Hitler and Governor Karl Hermann Frank needed to create an effect that would neutralize any intent to repeat similar operations, and they chose a target whose visible destruction would make the message unequivocal. The village of Lidice was linked to the case through a fabricated connection from a letter found in the apartment of one of the paratroopers, which mentioned contacts in that locality. The real connection was weak, and the Gestapo investigators knew this, but the decision to use Lidice was not based on its guilt but on its symbolic usefulness. On June 10, 1942, SS units and the order police surrounded the village before dawn. Men over the age of 15, a total of 173, were executed in groups in the garden of the Horak farm. The 184 women were sent to the Ravensbrück camp. The 88 children from the village were separated and sent to a camp in Łódź, where most of them died in the following weeks. The buildings were set on fire, the debris demolished, the trees felled, and the village name removed from official records. The operation was photographed and systematically documented by Frank's order for its dissemination as a demonstration. Ernst Kaltenbrunner assumed the leadership of the RSHA in January 1943. He lacked the direct, trust-based position with Hitler that Heydrich had cultivated and his ability to simultaneously integrate intelligence, police, and administrative functions, but the structure he inherited did not depend on the personal qualities of its director to function. In France, the delegation established on Avenue Foch in Paris operated as the most active interrogation center in occupied Western Europe. Its agents collaborated with the French militia, a paramilitary organization of the Vichy regime under Joseph Darnand, which provided precise local knowledge, networks of informants in cities and towns inland, and the ability to operate in areas where direct German presence would have immediately generated resistance. The preserved records from the Paris delegation indicate that between 1942 and 1944 it processed more than 15,000 cases, including members of resistance networks, captured Allied agents, and citizens reported for activities deemed hostile. Among the SOE agents captured in France under this system were several sent specifically to establish communications with local networks, whose detection was partly made possible by information provided by informants within the very networks they attempted to contact. In the Netherlands, the police apparatus found an operational resource with no equivalent in any other occupied territory. The Dutch civil registry system, built over decades with criteria of administrative thoroughness that placed it among the most detailed in Europe, covered more than 1,000 municipalities, with records that included not only identity and address data but also religious affiliation, family origin, and in many cases, information about specific communities that the records themselves distinguished with precise designations. Access to these municipal archives allowed the Gestapo and the Dutch SD to identify target populations with a speed and accuracy that in other countries would have required years of infiltration and the construction of informant networks. The work that in Poland had required lists compiled over years by the Sixth Office in Berlin could be accomplished in the Netherlands by consulting civil records available at any town hall. The Westerbork transit camp, established before the war by the Dutch government to house Jewish refugees from Germany and Austria, was repurposed as the concentration point from where transports to the eastern camps departed. The internal administration of the camp was forcibly assigned to a Jewish council that had to manage the daily life of the detainees and prepare the weekly transport lists. This delegation of the administrative function most directly linked to deportation onto the victims themselves was a feature of the system replicated across various territories with local variations. It reduced the visible administrative burden for the German authorities, distributed the bureaucratic responsibility in such a way that it hindered organized resistance, and created internal divisions among the detainees that weakened collective cohesion. The transports left on Tuesdays. Between July 1942 and September 1944, 107 convoys departed from Würzburg, carrying approximately 111,000 people. The deportation rate as a percentage of the identified Jewish population was the highest in Western Europe, a direct consequence of the combination of the precision of the Dutch civil registry, the administrative efficiency of the Westerbork system, and the density of the police network. By the end of 1941, the Gestapo was part of a network that operated simultaneously in 14 countries. Müller's offices in Berlin received reports from Paris, Brussels, Amsterdam, Oslo, Copenhagen, Warsaw, Prague, Athens, and Zagreb. Each delegation applied the same administrative procedures and sent its files to the same central hub. This bureaucratic uniformity over radically different scenarios was the most concrete result of what the RSHA had achieved in 2 years. The apparatus that had been created in 1933 to control political dissent in Berlin was now monitoring an entire continent. But in that same continent, in cities, universities, and factories under German occupation, structures had begun to form that operated in exactly the opposite direction, in secret, in silence, against the regime. Who dared to resist the Nazi regime, the final persecution of Hitler's enemies? In the fall of 1942, the radio direction finding teams of the Abwehr and the Gestapo located a radio transmitter in Brussels operating on frequencies used by Soviet intelligence services. The signal tracking took weeks. Technicians used mobile receivers installed in vans that traveled through the city's neighborhoods, triangulating the source of the transmissions and progressively narrowing the search radius until the signal was pinpointed to an apartment building in the Etterbeek district. When agents raided the location, they found the radio operator, his equipment, and some of the encrypted material he had been transmitting to Moscow. The subsequent interrogations led to an investigation that extended over the following months to Berlin, Paris, Amsterdam, and Geneva. The network emerging from these files had its core not in the occupied territories, but within the German state apparatus itself. Harro Schulze-Boysen was a Luftwaffe lieutenant stationed at the Reich Ministry of Aviation, where he had access to operational information about aircraft production, mission planning, and internal communications between commanders. Arvid Harnack was an official at the Reich Ministry of Economics with access to data on industrial capacity, raw material distribution, and war production projections. Over the years, both had built a network of contacts, with a discretion that their colleagues in the ministries never questioned, including military personnel, diplomats, artists, and civil servants willing to transmit information to Moscow. The network used radio transmitters, personal couriers, and secondary diplomatic channels to deliver its reports. The material transmitted included data on Operation Barbarossa that had reached Soviet intelligence before the invasion began in June 1941, although the Soviet Military Intelligence Service had initially dismissed it as possible German disinformation. Investigators referred to the network as the Rote Kapelle, or Red Orchestra, a term they had generically applied to Soviet intelligence networks in Western Europe, which became specifically associated with this group once its structure was reconstructed from the Brussels interrogations. The arrests began in August 1942. Schulze-Boysen was arrested on August 31st in Berlin. Harnack was arrested days later in East Prussia while on leave with his wife, American academic Mildred Fish Harnack, who was detained simultaneously. The interrogations produced names that led to new arrests, and each new detainee expanded the file with additional connections. More than 150 people were arrested over the following months in Germany and the occupied territories. The compartmentalization the network had attempted to maintain proved insufficient. Several of its members knew too many others, and under interrogation, these connections emerged quickly, allowing investigators from the Fourth Office of Müller to extend the investigation in multiple directions simultaneously. Schulze-Boysen, Harnack, and 16 other central members of the network were executed in December 1942. Mildred Fish Harnack was executed in February 1943, the only American citizen to be executed by direct order of Hitler during the conflict. The European ramifications continued to be investigated throughout 1943, with arrests in Switzerland and France, where cells with varying degrees of coordination with the Berlin Corps had operated under their own names and structures. 4 months after those executions, on February 18, 1943, Hans Scholl and his sister Sophie walked through the halls of the University of Munich, leaving copies of the 6th pamphlet of the White Rose on window sills and in front of classroom doors between classes when the corridors were empty. When the hallways were deserted, they went up to the 2nd floor and threw the remaining copies from the balustrade into the inner courtyard. Jakob Schmid, the building's janitor, watched them from below. He descended the stairs, confronted them, and physically detained them until the Gestapo arrived. Hans Scholl attempted to destroy a draft of the pamphlet he was carrying, but Schmid prevented him. The document contained handwritten notes, including the name of Christoph Probst. The White Rose had begun in the summer of 1942 as a group of medical students from Munich, including Hans and Sophie Scholl, Probst, Alexander Schmorell, and Willy Graf, along with university professor Kurt Huber. They distributed 6 pamphlets written by different members of the group, printed in quantities ranging from 100 copies of the first to several thousand of the last. These were mailed to doctors, teachers, and bar owners in Munich and other cities in southern Germany and left in telephone booths, trains, and public mailboxes. The texts cited Aristotle, Schiller, Goethe, and Ecclesiastes. They described the regime's crimes in the East with a detail obtained from soldiers on leave, and called for passive resistance from the German population against a government they considered morally untenable. The contrast between the Rote Kapelle and the White Rose reveals that the detection method did not depend on the sophistication of the network, but on the nature of its exposure to the environment. Schulze-Beuys and Harnack had operated for years with professional discipline, encryption, strict compartmentalization, and real intelligence resources. They were detected through signal tracking technology systematically applied to the frequencies used by the GRU in Western Europe, a method that did not rely on informants or human errors but on applied physics. The White Rose had no encryption, no compartmentalization, and operated in the public space of their own university. It was detected by a janitor doing his job. Radically different methods, identical result. Both networks were completely destroyed within weeks of their first contact with the police system. The trial before the Volksgerichtshof took place on February 22, 4 days after the Scholl arrests. Freisler presided over the session. The records show that he interrupted the accused multiple times before they could complete their statements, systematically raised his voice to prevent the defense arguments from being developed before the panel, and described the accused in terms that no ordinary procedural regulations would have tolerated. Hans Scholl, Sophie Scholl, and Christoph Probst were executed that same afternoon at Stadelheim prison by guillotine. The executioner, Johann Reichhardt, recorded in his logbook that the 3 walked to the scaffold without needing to be restrained. Schmorell and Huber were executed in July. Graf in October. Professor Huber had written the 6th pamphlet, the same one Hans and Sophie Scholl were distributing when Schmid detained them. On July 20, 1944, at noon, Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg placed a briefcase under the map table in the Führerhauptquartier Wolfschanze conference room in East Prussia and left the room under the pretense of a phone call. The explosion occurred 4 minutes later. 4 people died. Hitler survived with burns and ear injuries because the briefcase had been moved to the end of the table by Colonel Heinz Brandt, who died in the explosion. Before the detonation took place, Stauffenberg, who was already on his plane back to Berlin, convinced of success, landed in the capital and began coordinating the execution of the planned political action under the code name Operation Valkyrie. The confusion of the early hours, fueled by contradictory reports about whether Hitler was alive or dead, delayed the full activation of the plan and allowed regime-loyal military sectors to regain control in Berlin before the conspirators could consolidate key positions. General Friedrich Fromm, who knew of the conspiracy and had wavered between participation and distance depending on how events unfolded, ordered the arrest of Stauffenberg and the other officers present at the Ministry of War when it became clear that Hitler had survived. Stauffenberg, his aide Werner von Haiften, General Friedrich Olbricht and General Albrecht Merz von Quirnheim were executed in the ministry's courtyard in the early hours of July 21. Fromm hoped these quick executions would protect him by eliminating the witnesses to his prior knowledge. They did not protect him. He was arrested days later and executed in March 1945. Müller was authorized to act without the usual procedural restrictions. Over the following weeks, the Gestapo arrested more than 7,000 people. The scope of the investigation progressively expanded in multiple directions, towards army officers who had had contact with the conspirators, towards civil servants who had participated in discussions about a post-Hitler Germany, towards the families of the identified individuals, and towards anyone mentioned in the interrogations as a possible contact in any context. The concept of Sippenhaft, the collective responsibility of family members, was applied systematically and explicitly. The wives of several of the main conspirators were arrested regardless of any known involvement in the events. The children of some of the executed were separated from their mothers and sent to state institutions under altered names to sever any connection with their parents. Nina von Stauffenberg, pregnant at the time of her arrest, gave birth in prison. Her 4 older children were interned under the surname Meister. The application of Sippenhaft to the families of the July 20th conspirators led to more than 200 additional arrests, none of which had any operational link to the assassination attempt. The Kreisauer Kreis, the political discussion group formed around the Prussian aristocrat Helmuth James von Moltke, who had debated for years the constitutional and moral foundations of a post-Nazi Germany without participating in any direct planning, was swept up in the investigation after July 20th because of their personal connections with several of the conspirators. Moltke had been arrested in January 1944 for different reasons, related to a warning he had passed on to an official about a Gestapo investigation, and was tried by Freisler. The trial produced one of the most revealing documents about the logic that the Volksgerichtshof applied during this final phase of the regime. Freisler focused on the fact that Moltke had had conversations with Jesuit priests about the legitimacy of obedience to the state. In the correspondence Moltke wrote to his wife Freya from Tegel prison, preserved and published after the war, he described this accusation as an unexpected confirmation. What the regime considered sufficient for a death sentence was having thought, not having acted. Moltke was executed on January 23, 1945. Karl Friedrich Goerdeler, the conservative economist and former mayor of Leipzig, designated in the conspirators' plans as the future chancellor of a post-Hitler Germany, was captured in August 1944 in Marienwerder after 3 weeks on the run with false documents. The interrogations he underwent during the following months provided the Gestapo with information about connections, plans, and previous conversations the conspirators had maintained over the years. His ability to provide additional information was the reason his execution was deliberately delayed, while Müller's investigators extracted all available material from his statements. He was executed on February 2, 1945, 6 months after his capture. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel had been identified in the post-July 20th interrogations as someone who knew of the existence of a conspiracy, though he had not participated in the planning of the assassination attempt. Several conspirators had been in contact with him in the months prior, exploring whether he was willing to support a political change, and these conversations had been recorded in statements obtained under interrogation. His name in the files was politically unmanageable for reasons the regime itself recognized internally. The most popular marshal in Germany, symbol of the North African campaign, and a figurehead for large sections of the military and civilian population, a public trial before Freisler would have had effects on army morale and the internal cohesion of the regime that no judicial outcome could compensate. On October 14, 1944, 2 generals, Wilhelm Burgdorf and Ernst Meisel, arrived at his residence in Herrlingen with direct instructions from Hitler. They presented him with the alternative precisely, trial before the Volksgerichtshof, with the consequences that this entailed for his family under the rules of Sippenhaft or death by poisoning, with a guaranteed state funeral, a pension for his wife and son, and formal protection for his immediate surroundings. He chose poison. He left the house in the general's car. 15 minutes later, he was dead. The official statement drafted in advance claimed he had died from injuries sustained in Normandy. The state funeral was held as planned. The trials of the main conspirators before the Volksgerichtshof began in August 1944. Hitler ordered that the sessions be filmed for projection before selected military commanders. Freisler presided over the hearings with a theatricality that the court's own records document. He forbade the accused from adjusting their clothing during the sessions, filmed them deliberately in conditions of visible humiliation with suits that lacked belts or suspenders, causing them to fall off their shoulders, and systematically denied them the opportunity to present full defenses by interrupting them before they could finish their arguments. Field Marshal Erwin von Witzleben, one of the accused in the first trial, attempted several times to address the court with the composure appropriate to his rank. The records show that Freisler interrupted him every time. 8 of the accused in that first trial were executed at Plötzensee prison by hanging with piano wires attached to butcher hooks, a method specifically chosen by Hitler to produce a slower and more degrading death than ordinary execution by shooting. The executions were filmed. Hitler viewed the footage that same night. On February 2, 1945, Fabian von Schlabrendorf, an officer who had participated in an earlier assassination attempt prior to July 20th by personally transporting explosives on Hitler's plane without the bomb detonating, appeared before the Volksgerichtshof for his trial. Freisler was presiding over the session with Schlabrendorf's file in his hands when air raid sirens interrupted the process. The attendees headed to the building's shelters. A bomb from the Allied attack hit the courtroom. Freisler died under the rubble. When the rescue teams recovered his body, they found him still holding Schlabrendorf's file. The accused survived the collapse with minor injuries, was evacuated and transferred to the Dachau concentration camp, where he was liberated by Allied forces in May 1945. The man who had presided over thousands of death sentences, who had publicly humiliated the July 20th conspirators before the regime's cameras, and who that very day had come to judge Schlabrendorf, died crushed while the accused he had held in his hands walked out of the same building alive. No successor with comparable authority was appointed to complete the pending trials before the final collapse. With the Allied advance during the final months of 1944 and the early months of 1945, Gestapo delegations began destroying documents. The execution was deeply irregular. In some cities, officials burned entire files in the courtyards of their buildings days before the Allied arrival, destroying archives containing 12 years of investigations, names of informants protected by codes, interrogation records, and decisions on deportations. In others, the speed of the advance left insufficient time to complete the destruction. In Nuremberg, the city court files fell intact into Allied hands. In Düsseldorf, British forces recovered a significant portion of the local Gestapo files before the destruction was completed. In Würzburg, the files that Gellately would study decades later survived because the official responsible for their destruction abandoned them in the building when he withdrew. The Berlin Document Center, which concentrated party and SS personnel records, partially survived because the officer responsible for its incineration delayed the operation until the Soviet advance made it impossible to execute with the required time. Heinrich Müller disappeared from Berlin in the final days of the April and May 1945 fighting. He was last seen in the Reich Chancellery bunker during the final hours of the regime. He was never located, never tried, and was never officially declared dead with documented certainty. Investigations carried out in the decades following his disappearance by Western intelligence services, and historians did not produce a definitive conclusion about his fate. The files Müller had administered for 11 years, the records containing the traces of hundreds of thousands of destroyed lives, the informant records, and the decisions on deportations were either burned in office courtyards or fell into the hands of Allied investigators, depending on which unit arrived first at each building. The recovered documents allowed historians to reconstruct something that the institution's reputation had concealed for years. The Gestapo had not been omnipresent. It had been effective because a part of German society had fed it information that its own agents could not have gathered. 22 agents in Würzburg, a janitor in Munich, a letter from a neighbor in Berlin. The system that had for 12 years produced hundreds of thousands of files, deported tens of thousands of people to camps, and hunted resistance networks in 14 countries simultaneously had depended, at its most basic level, on whether ordinary citizens decided each day whether to speak or remain silent, whether to denounce or look the other way. This decision, multiplied by millions of people over 12 years, was the true infrastructure of terror.